The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days when we buried Margaret Chen. It seemed fitting somehow, as if the sky itself was mourning the loss of a woman who had touched so many lives in our small town of Millbrook. I stood under my black umbrella, watching the mahogany casket being lowered into the ground, and tried to make sense of the gnawing feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. Margaret had been my neighbor for 15 years. She was 72 years old, vibrant, sharp as a tack, and probably in better shape than most people half her age. She power-walked every morning at 6, tended her rose garden with religious devotion, and volunteered at the library 3 times a week. The official cause of death was a heart attack. Sudden, they said. Unexpected, they said. But as I stood there in the drizzling rain, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were wrong. It started with the flowers. Margaret despised lilies. I remembered it clearly because she had once spent 20 minutes explaining to me why she found them morbid and overpowering. "They smell like death, Daniel," she had said, wrinkling her nose. "If I ever see lilies at my funeral, you'll know something's gone terribly wrong." She had laughed when she said it, but I remembered the intensity in her eyes. The casket was covered in lilies. White, pristine, and absolutely everywhere. I glanced around at the other mourners. Margaret's nephew, Richard, stood closest to the grave, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. He had flown in from Seattle the day after her death, and according to the funeral director, he had made all the arrangements. Richard and Margaret had never been close as far as I knew. In fact, I could count on one hand the number of times I'd seen him visit her in the past decade. My eyes moved to Dr. Patricia Holloway, Margaret's physician, who stood near the back of the small crowd. Her face was impassive, professional, but I noticed her hands were clenched tightly around her umbrella handle. When our eyes met, she looked away quickly. The service concluded with generic platitudes from a minister who clearly hadn't known Margaret well. He spoke of her peaceful passing and long, fulfilling life, using the kind of templated language that could apply to anyone. Margaret deserved better. She deserved someone who knew about her love of mystery novels, her wicked sense of humor, her Tuesday chess games with Harold from the hardware store, her legendary chocolate chip cookies that she'd bring to every neighborhood gathering. As people began to disperse, I approached Dr. Holloway. We had met several times at community events, and I knew she had been Margaret's doctor for at least a decade. "Dr. Holloway," I said, positioning my umbrella to shield us both from the rain. I was surprised to hear about Margaret. She seemed so healthy. The doctor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "These things happen, Mr. Torres. Heart attacks can strike without warning, even in seemingly healthy individuals. But Margaret was so careful about her health. She told me just 2 weeks ago that you'd given her a clean bill of health at her last checkup." Dr. Holloway's eyes flickered with something I couldn't quite identify. Worry, perhaps, or fear. "I really can't discuss patient information, even with a deceased patient, if you'll excuse me." She walked away quickly, leaving me standing alone in the rain, more convinced than ever that something was wrong. That evening, I sat in my study, Margaret's last words to me echoing in my mind. It had been 4 days before her death. She had knocked on my door around 9 in the evening, which was unusual because she was typically in bed by 8:30. Her face had been pale and she seemed agitated. "Daniel," she had said, gripping my arm with surprising strength, "I need you to remember something. If anything happens to me, anything unexpected, I want you to look in the blue box." "Margaret, what are you talking about? Are you okay? Just promise me," she had insisted, her eyes intense. "The blue box in my study. Promise me you'll look." I had promised, thinking she was being overly dramatic. Margaret had always had a flair for the theatrical, especially after a few glasses of wine. But now, standing in my study 4 days after her funeral, those words took on a sinister significance. The problem was gaining access to her house. Richard had already been by earlier that week, and I'd seen a for sale sign go up in the yard with alarming speed. He was clearly eager to liquidate her estate and return to Seattle. I needed to act fast. The next morning I called Sarah Mitchell, Margaret's best friend and the only person I knew who might have a spare key. Sarah was 80 years old and sharp as a tack, with a BS detector that could rival any investigator's. "Daniel," she said when she answered the phone, her voice heavy with grief. "I was hoping you'd call. Sarah, I need to talk to you about Margaret. Come over. Now. I've been waiting for someone to say something." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Sarah's cramped but cozy living room, accepting a cup of tea I didn't particularly want. Sarah sat across from me, her weathered hands wrapped around her own cup, and looked at me with eyes that missed nothing. "The lilies," she said simply. "You noticed too. Margaret hated lilies. Told everyone who'd listen. That nephew of hers either didn't know or didn't care." She paused, taking a sip of tea. "But it's more than that, Daniel. Margaret called me 2 days before she died. She was frightened." My heart began to race. Frightened of what? She wouldn't say exactly. Just kept saying she'd found something out. Something that changed everything. She said she needed to talk to her lawyer, update her will. She mentioned you, actually. Me? She said you were one of the few people she could trust. That if anything happened to her, you'd figure it out. Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Daniel, Margaret didn't have a bad heart. She had the heart of a 50-year-old, according to Dr. Holloway. I know because I was with her at her last appointment." The doctor was amazed. "Did she seem sick at all in the days before her death?" Sarah shook her head. "That's what's so strange. She was fine on Monday when we had lunch. She mentioned feeling a bit tired on Tuesday when she called me, but nothing concerning. Then Wednesday morning, Richard called to say she'd been found dead in her bed. Heart attack, he said. By the time I got to the house, the coroner had already been and gone. Everything happened so fast." "Too fast," I murmured. "Exactly." Sarah set down her teacup with a decisive clink. "I do have a spare key, but Richard changed the locks yesterday. I tried to go by to collect some photos and my key didn't work." This was getting worse by the minute. "What about the lawyer? Did Margaret get a chance to update her will?" "I don't know. Her lawyer is Thomas Brennan over on Maple Street. I called his office, but his secretary said she couldn't discuss client matters. I spent the rest of the day thinking through my options. I couldn't exactly break into Margaret's house, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that blue box was important, possibly even evidence of foul play. That night I made a decision that would change everything. I called Richard. "Mr. Chen, this is Daniel Torres, your aunt's neighbor. I'm so sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Richard's voice was smooth, practiced. "Margaret spoke highly of you." That was a lie. Margaret had rarely mentioned Richard except to express disappointment in his visits becoming increasingly rare over the years. I was wondering if I might stop by the house tomorrow. Margaret had borrowed a book from me, a first edition that has sentimental value. I'd love to retrieve it before the estate sale. There was a pause. "I'm actually flying back to Seattle tomorrow morning. The estate sale won't be for another few weeks. Why don't you come by tonight, say around 8? It was almost too easy. I agreed and hung up, my mind racing. Why would Richard be so accommodating? Unless he wanted something from me or wanted to keep an eye on what I was looking for. At precisely 8 o'clock, I knocked on Margaret's front door. Richard answered immediately, dressed in expensive casual wear that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. He was in his early 40s, with the kind of polished appearance that came from good genetics and better personal trainers. "Mr. Torres, come in. Please make yourself at home. I'm just finishing up some paperwork in the kitchen. The study is just down the hall, second door on the left. Take your time finding your book." He was letting me roam unsupervised. That was interesting. I walked down the familiar hallway, past family photos that showed a younger, happier Margaret, with a husband who had died 20 years ago. The study was exactly as I remembered it, lined with bookshelves, dominated by an old oak desk, and filled with the faint scent of the lavender sachets Margaret loved. The blue box sat on the desk, almost as if it had been waiting for me. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside were several documents, a small leather journal, and a USB drive. I quickly scanned the documents. They appeared to be financial records, medical reports, and correspondence with a lawyer. My eye caught on one letter in particular, dated just 5 days before Margaret's death. It was from Thomas Brennan, her attorney, confirming an appointment to discuss urgent matters regarding your estate and the disturbing information you've uncovered. I pocketed the USB drive and was about to take the journal when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Quickly, I returned the box to its position and grabbed a random book from the shelf just as Richard appeared in the doorway. "Found what you were looking for?" he asked, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Yes, thank you." I held up the book. Ironically, it was one of Margaret's beloved mystery novels. "Agatha Christie fan?" Richard asked, glancing at the title. "Margaret and I used to discuss them," I said, which was true. Richard nodded, but something in his expression had changed. His eyes flicked to the desk, to the blue box, then back to me. "You know, my aunt was quite paranoid toward the end. Thought people were out to get her. It's sad when elderly people decline mentally like that. Margaret was sharp as a tack, I said firmly. There was nothing wrong with her mental faculties. Of course, Richard said smoothly. I just meant that she'd been making some strange accusations, worried about things that weren't real. Dr. Holloway mentioned it. Dr. Holloway told you that? We spoke several times about Aunt Margaret's care. The doctor was concerned. Richard checked his watch, a Rolex that probably cost more than my car. I hate to rush you, but I have an early flight. I took the hint and left, but not before noticing that Richard immediately went into the study as soon as I was out the door. I waited in my car down the street, and sure enough, within 10 minutes I saw Richard emerge from the house carrying a box, presumably the blue one, and place it in his trunk. Whatever was in those documents, Richard didn't want anyone else to see them. The next morning I examined the USB drive I'd managed to pocket. It contained scanned documents, email correspondence, and photos. What I found made my blood run cold. Margaret had discovered that Richard had been systematically embezzling from her accounts for the past 3 years. He had power of attorney for her finances, something she had granted during a brief hospital stay for pneumonia, and he had been using it to funnel money into offshore accounts. We were talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. But that wasn't all. Margaret had also been investigating a pattern of suspicious deaths at Millbrook Senior Living Center, where she volunteered. 3 residents had died unexpectedly in the past year, all from heart attacks, all after revising their wills to leave substantial bequests to the center's director, who happened to be Richard's girlfriend, Diane Patterson. Margaret's notes were meticulous. She had documented everything, collected witness statements from staff members who had noticed irregularities in medication administration, and even obtained copies of the modified wills. She had been scheduled to meet with the police the day after she died. My hands were shaking as I read her final journal entry, written the night before her death. I know what I have to do. Tomorrow, I'll go to the police with everything I've found. Richard called today wanting to visit, but I told him I was busy. I think he suspects something. I've made copies of everything and given them to Thomas. If anything happens to me, the truth will come out. I'm not afraid. What's the worst they can do? I've lived a good life, but I am doing this for those 3 poor souls who died and for any future victims. Some things are more important than staying safe. Margaret had known she was in danger, and she'd been right. I immediately called Sarah Mitchell. We need to call the police. I have evidence that Margaret was murdered. I was hoping you'd say that, Sarah replied, because I've been doing some investigating of my own. Meet me at the police station in 30 minutes. I have something to show you. At the police station, we met with Detective Jennifer Wu, who listened to our story with increasing concern. Sarah had brought her own evidence, medical records she had obtained from a sympathetic nurse at the hospital where Margaret had died. Look at this. Sarah pointed to the toxicology report. They did a standard screening, but it didn't include testing for certain drugs. I asked a friend who's a retired pharmacist, and she said there are several substances that can induce heart attacks and won't show up on a standard screening. Detective Wu leaned forward, now fully engaged. And you're saying you have evidence of a financial motive and a pattern of similar deaths? I handed her the USB drive. It's all here. Margaret documented everything. The investigation moved quickly after that. Detective Wu obtained warrants to exhume Margaret's body for a more comprehensive toxicology screening. They also launched investigations into the 3 deaths at the Senior Living Center. Within a week, the results came back. Margaret had been poisoned with a combination of digitalis and potassium chloride, a deadly combination that mimics a heart attack perfectly. The drug combination was only found because they knew to look for it specifically. Richard was arrested at SeaTac Airport, trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands with 3 suitcases full of cash. In his rental car, they found a small vial containing the same substances that had killed Margaret. Diane Patterson was arrested at the Senior Living Center. A search of her office revealed detailed records of the scheme, along with medications that had been reported as disposed of, but were actually being stockpiled for use in the murders. The full scope of their operation was staggering. Richard and Diane had met 5 years ago and had concocted a plan to systematically target wealthy elderly individuals. Diane would befriend them at the senior center. Richard would establish himself as a trusted family member or financial advisor, and together they would manipulate will changes before administering lethal doses of heart attack-inducing drugs. Margaret had been their 6th intended victim, but she was the one who had figured it out. Her volunteer work at the center had given her access to information others wouldn't have seen. Her natural curiosity and sharp mind had connected dots that were meant to remain hidden. The trial was a media sensation. Prosecutors charged Richard and Diane with 6 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of fraud, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. Margaret's meticulous documentation, combined with the forensic evidence and testimony from staff members at the senior center, painted a damning picture. Both were convicted on all counts. Richard received life in prison without the possibility of parole. Diane received the same sentence. Several staff members at the senior center who had turned a blind eye to suspicious activities also faced criminal charges. 6 months after Margaret's funeral, Sarah and I stood in front of a newly installed memorial in Millbrook Park. The town council had voted unanimously to dedicate a bench and rose garden to Margaret Chen, honoring her courage and the lives she had saved through her investigation. The plaque read, "In memory of Margaret Chen, whose courage and sharp mind brought justice for those who could not speak for themselves, a true friend to all, and a hero to this community." "She would have hated the fuss," Sarah said softly, but she was smiling. "She would have pretended to hate it," I corrected, "but secretly, she would have loved it." We sat on the bench, surrounded by the rose garden that the local gardening club had planted in Margaret's honor. The roses were carefully selected varieties. No lilies in sight. "You know what the worst part is?" Sarah asked. "If you hadn't noticed the lilies, if you hadn't remembered what she said about the blue box, Richard and Diane might have gotten away with it. They could have killed more people." "Margaret knew someone would notice," I said. "That's why she left the clues. She knew her friends wouldn't let her death go unquestioned." The investigation had also prompted a statewide review of procedures at senior living facilities. New protocols were implemented for medication management, financial oversight, and reporting suspicious deaths. Margaret's case had sparked reforms that would protect countless vulnerable elderly individuals in the future. Dr. Holloway had also come forward with information after the arrests. She had been suspicious of Margaret's sudden death and had tried to push for a more thorough autopsy. But Richard, as next of kin, had refused and had the body cremated as quickly as possible. Or at least he had tried to. The funeral home had been slow to process the paperwork, which had given us the window we needed for the exhumation order. As I sat in that rose garden, I thought about all the small details that had come together to expose the truth. The lilies, the blue box, Sarah's suspicions, Dr. Holloway's concerns, the funeral home's bureaucratic delays. Margaret had often said that the devil was in the details, that small inconsistencies could unravel the most carefully planned crimes. She had been right about that too. In the year since Margaret's death, I've thought a lot about justice, about truth, and about the importance of paying attention. How many crimes go unnoticed because nobody questions the official narrative? How many people die, and their deaths are explained away as natural causes, accidents, or simply bad luck? Margaret taught me that it's not enough to accept what we're told. Sometimes the truth is hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone curious enough, brave enough, or stubborn enough to look for it. The roses in Margaret's memorial garden bloom year-round now, tended by volunteers who never knew her but were inspired by her story. Sometimes I see elderly visitors sitting on the bench, chatting or reading, and I like to think Margaret would be pleased. She always said that the best memorial wasn't a stone monument but a living space where people could gather and enjoy life. She was right about that too. She was right about most things. I still have that Agatha Christie book I grabbed from her shelf the night I found the USB drive. Inside the front cover, in Margaret's distinctive handwriting, is an inscription I hadn't noticed before. "The truth is rarely pure and never simple, but it's always worth pursuing. MC." Those words guide me now. When something seems off, when the official story doesn't add up, when the details don't quite align, I remember Margaret and her roses and her hatred of lilies. I remember that justice sometimes depends on ordinary people being willing to ask uncomfortable questions and pursue uncomfortable truths. Margaret Chen was murdered because she asked those questions, but in the end, her murderers were brought to justice for the same reason. The truth, as Margaret knew, has a way of emerging, if someone cares enough to look for it, and I'll always be grateful that she trusted me to be that someone.